Welcome everybody to our webinar tonight that we've titled Building a Winning Content Strategy for Football Clubs. And the reason we wanted to do this webinar is because, as you all know, we live in a world that is increasingly becoming more and more digital. And of course, for football clubs, football organizations, it becomes something very important, to be competitive beyond the pitch. And how do you engage your fans? How do you grow your brand as a football club? How do you connect with audiences? And at the end of the day, how do you create compelling content? So what we've planned for the webinar tonight is for you to have some key takeaways. And of course, we're delighted to welcome our guest, Simon Meehan. Simon is the head of content at Newcastle United, and I'm sure he will explain to you a little bit in just a moment about his background. He's garnered professional experience working in Premier League clubs, the likes of Brentford, Chelsea, and now Newcastle United. And he's someone that has collaborated with SBI for a number of years. And we're obviously very, very happy to have him back and sharing his insights and his knowledge with us. For those of you that may not know who I am, my name is Diego Valdez. I am the founder and general director at the Sports Business Institute Barcelona. Most people know us as SBI or SBI Barcelona. And what we do is we deliver training, courses, education for those that want to either start or advance their career in the business side of football. And in fact, we're going to be talking about one of the courses that we are about to launch in a few weeks. We'll leave that for a little bit later. Tonight, we're going to focus on a few questions that I've prepared and Simon is going to discuss with us. And then we'll open the floor for you guys and your questions. We should run for about an hour. And then with that, we will wrap it up for tonight. So Simon, I'll turn it over to you. It's a real pleasure to have you here. Thank you. It's going to be a nice discussion tonight.
Thank you, Diego. An extremely kind and generous introduction as ever. Yes, hello everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. The reason why I always like doing anything with SBI Barcelona is a very personal one, because SBI Barcelona was actually crucial to me starting my career in the football industry. I used to work completely outside of football for about 12 or 13 years, worked in the world of public affairs, of communications, working for corporations, and at a certain point, I decided that I wanted to follow my passion. I wanted to work in the business side of football. I was obviously far too old to be able to play football at that stage, and that dream had evaporated. So the next step was to work on the business side. And my very, very first step in order to achieve that was doing a course with SBI Barcelona in 2016, which really set me on that path. So it's a very personally happy moment to be coming back and to be speaking with all of you tonight. As Diego says, since making the switch, I've worked at three different football clubs. So my first club was Chelsea FC, and I was there for 3.5 years. More recently, I was at Brentford, and I just joined this year in January Newcastle United, all of which are Premier League clubs. And the consistent thing is that I've worked in the content space and to an extent the communication space at these clubs. So very delighted to be here. I know that Diego has a number of different questions, and I will try to answer them as best as possible, so you get some sort of feeling and understanding of what it's like to work in these clubs in this type of role, and how perhaps SBI might help you achieve that if that's something that you're interested in doing.
Fantastic. Thank you for the introduction, Simon. So we can begin with some of the questions that we've planned for tonight, and then of course we'll open it up for you guys, for your questions. So stay tuned till the end, because you will have an opportunity to ask your own questions for Simon. So in order to start, Simon, I mean, one of the questions that we thought would be interesting to kick off the webinar is understanding, what are the key components of a successful content strategy for football clubs. So how do we go about creating a strategy that has an impact?
Yeah, I think that's a really key question, Diego, because obviously there is a lot of football content out there. There's a lot of content out there. There is a huge amount of competition between clubs, between different sports, between different sources of entertainment, even for the attention, the limited attention that all of us have. We only have so many hours in the day. We only have so many hours in the day that we can actually consume content. And so football clubs are not immune to this. They are all kind of competing within that space for people's attention. So I think the starting point for successful content strategy is to understand that that is the dynamic, and that actually way before you reach the end point of content, which is somebody consuming that or experiencing it or watching it or reading it or whatever it might be on a digital channel, there is a whole load of work that needs to go into that way before then. And I think there are basically, the way I see it is there are three critical steps to that. One is you have to have a plan. So you have to be planned, organized, understand what resources you have, what you are trying to achieve, how that is going to be achieved, when it is going to be achieved, and be able to map all of that out through some sort of plan. And in my case, I quite often have a very simple Excel sheet that has all of this in a very visual format, because that's the way that I like to work. And then the second step related to that is your process. So how are you going to deliver on this plan? How are you going to do the things that you want to do, going from point of resource and organization to the delivery of that content onto the digital channel that you want to deliver it on, and to the audiences that you want to deliver it to. And you will need to have a certain amount of process around that. And to give you a concrete example, clearly, if a football club is signing a player in a transfer window, we've just had a transfer window, then you need to have some form of process that allows you to, okay, understand in the content team that a player may be signing, have a process around what are the right types of ideas to announce this player signing for the club, and then have a process around what is the right time for that. You need to agree that time with the club that the player is joining from. You need to agree it with the player or their agent. And so you very much need to have your processes in place that allow you to do all of those things. Otherwise, as you can imagine, there are a number of different areas that it could fall down. And then the other fundamental part for me is your basis is planning and process, but ultimately what you're trying to do is tell the stories of a football club. So a content strategy is really about storytelling. How are you bringing this club to the rest of the world? How are you bringing this club to audiences, to fans, to people across the world, people locally? And so the critical element is really, how do you tell those stories? What are the stories to tell, whether it's about players, fans, staff, key moments, whatever it may be, but having an understanding of what stories you want to tell, and how you want to do that. And that will be different depending on the club. Obviously, the three clubs that I have worked at are all very, very different. You know, Chelsea is very different in scale to a Brentford, for example, and also in terms of the success that they previously had. So the stories that you'll be telling will be very different. I think it's really important to, as a part of any content strategy, understand what is real, what is authentic about that specific club, and how you want to tell those stories.
Excellent. And Simon, you touched upon telling the story and connecting with the fans. So building on that, and how can clubs use the content to enhance that loyalty and, you know, engage with the fans both in offline and online channels?
Yeah, I think the premise is always kind of the same from my perspective in content, and that aspect of storytelling, that actually you are trying to create some sort of emotional connection or emotional reaction between the club and the fan, or the person who isn't a fan but is interested, or the person who is casually a fan. And so you want to be creating those connections, whatever they are, through emotional storytelling as much as you possibly can. And it's, again, based on what is authentic and what is true about that specific club. It has to be, if you are telling the stories at Brentford, they are not going to be the same as Chelsea, and you should not try and copy what Chelsea are doing, is my own personal view on how to approach it, because you are trying to create those authentic connections. And I think that's what ultimately will lead you to fan loyalty, because if you are presenting them with content that they can engage with, that they enjoy engaging with, that creates some sort of reaction and connection, then they will continue to come back to you. Alongside that, I think it is useful to have in mind, I suppose, the classic marketing funnel. So something that I often include in presentations or in strategies or the work that I'm doing is just to always have in mind that funnel from you are creating awareness about the club, you want people to be considering the club, and then you want them to convert in some way. You want them to convert into being a fan, or perhaps you want them to convert into buying a ticket to a match, or to buy a membership, or to buy a shirt of their favorite player. And beyond that, you want that to be a consistent engagement. So you want to create that loyalty. So content, I think if you use that as that thought process as a starting point for your content, you are in fact not just creating things to put them out into the wide world or to get X number of likes on Instagram or because you like making it, but actually you are trying to build that fan loyalty. Then it becomes an easier task to achieve that. And I think you can do that obviously online, but then your content ultimately, if you're able to create that that connection online, then I do think it enhances it offline as well. And to give you a very quick example on that, when I was at Brentford, we deliberately celebrated our men's first team players who went to play in the African Cup of Nations, for example. So we had a couple of players who played in it, and we did a lot of content around them. One of them reached the final. We really celebrated them, heroed them. And even though one of the players who got to the final wasn't necessarily a regular starter at the club, when he came back and when he came on as a substitute, there was a really good reaction for him in the stadium. And I would like to think that that offline reaction was at least in part helped and enhanced by the fact that we as a club were consistently communicating that we really appreciated this player, really celebrated his successes for his national team as well.
Excellent, excellent. And I mean, if we move on to our next question, and this goes in line sort of what you were saying now, and of course you've worked at clubs like Chelsea that have, fans all over the world, Newcastle United in a way very similar, and as you just mentioned, the example of Brentford having those African players. So how do you balance creating content for that global audience in the case of those, large football clubs that do have this global audience, but also at the same time keeping the local fans engaged? So obviously, this can sometimes be a challenge, but how do you guys manage this in content teams?
Yeah, I think, Diego, that's actually something that's quite difficult because across any club, you will have a different balance between the local fan base and the global fan base or the global audience or people that you want to be speaking to. In some cases, like a Chelsea, well, actually, that club has quite an interesting and important history of obviously being located in a very nice part of London, let's say, quite a famous part of London, West London, near the King's Road, and it had that sort of that cachet in the 1960s of being in that location, and then obviously in the 90s started to sign international players like Ruud Gullit, Gianluca Vialli, Gianfranco Zola, all of these players, and had built up a little bit, I think, of an international standing, an international presence. And then obviously in the early 2000s, you had the arrival of Mr. Roman Abramovich, who acquired the club and then led the club to huge success over 20 years in an era before really there was any sort of social media. It kind of, obviously social media grew at the same time as the club grew. So in a situation like Chelsea, you almost from a standing start had this global audience and had a local fan base. And the two, while they didn't always necessarily like the same things or enjoy the same things or engage in the same ways, there was a sort of, I don't know, acceptance or understanding that Chelsea was a global football club by that stage. Whereas at other smaller clubs, that might not be the case. And those smaller clubs may have the intention to actually grow and try to reach new fans. So I think the key then is, you have to do, again, you have to find what is authentic to the club, what is true about that club, what is different about that club, and find the common threads between what a local fan will like and what an international fan will like, and try and build those connections again, try and work through those threads. And I think the other aspect to say is that what anybody creating a content strategy should do as well is a huge amount of research. So understand, what do fans like? What do they expect of your club? What would they like to see? What is it that makes them have an affinity with you? And try and build on that, and then use as much data as you possibly can to learn whether your content is successful or not successful, and then continue to iterate on that basis, continue to refine and try again. So I think that's the best way of approaching it. We had some success at Brentford in doing that, in focusing on certain markets and growing in there. And then I think, you know, at a club like Newcastle, obviously very, very, very big club in England, huge, passionate fan base, and that's something that we want to try and take to the rest of the world as well. So that's a task in front of me now, but in my experience, that's probably the best way I can think of approaching that.
Right. Now, you also talked about just recently, and you said about telling a story, and of course, each club has to tell their own story, right? But if you could think of just perhaps some clubs that come to mind that are excelling at content and content strategy, you know, what sets them apart? What do you think makes them stand out when it comes to the way that they, you know, they put out their content?
Yeah, I think I can think of 3 examples off the top of my head for differing reasons. I think it's not a club, but the way that the England national teams, and I say this as a Scot, by the way, but the way that the England national teams have shaped their content, particularly since 2016. So if you remember, in 2016, the England men's national team were they were defeated by Iceland in the second round of the European Championships in France. It was a bit of a disaster. There was a lot of negative sentiment towards the team and towards the players. And actually, the content team at England were able to, they put in a consistent strategy of heroing their players, showcasing their players, showing the human side, using the access that they had, and as I understand it, working very closely with the coaching staff. And obviously they had a very empathetic and good leader in Gareth Southgate who understood that task as well. And I think that was a really good example of content working to change the perception and the sentiment of fans towards a specific team. They were obviously then helped, but I think it was a bit, you know, symbiotic. The fact that the fans were really on board helped them on the pitch, and obviously then the success on the pitch helped the fans to get more and more bought into the team and the players, and they reached the semi-finals of the World Cup in 2018, the final of the European Championships, and twice, and so on. So that's a really good example of using human player storytelling and using that and setting yourself apart and focusing on that. Another good example is Arsenal, who've done a huge amount in terms of really locating themselves in North London and owning that North London space. And again, that has worked both in terms of the content that they've done, and there's some great examples. You know, a couple of years ago, the campaign where they were backing local businesses, and they had Aaron Ramsdale going into a local fish and chip shop in the area, was great. But then also, if you watch an Arsenal game now, you'll hear them singing the song that is about North London, has the line North London forever, and you'll see the players in their huddle singing along with it and the fans singing. So I think they've been very good at utilizing that sense of location and where they're from to create or to enhance the identity that they have, and that really sets them apart, even though there is another North London club in the Premier League in the shape of Tottenham Hotspur. And then the last example, I think, is a little bit different in the sense that it's not necessarily that necessarily from a storytelling aspect to start with, but I think Juventus, with the rebrand, obviously they had a few years ago, whether you like the rebrand or you don't like the rebrand, what they have done is been incredibly consistent about it. So in terms of the fact that they obviously, the most sort of notable thing that everyone thinks about is changing the crest or the badge of the club. But obviously creatively, across all of the different assets that they created around that, the strategy that they've applied using those assets, being consistent around it, launching an Instagram page that is based more on kind of lifestyle and giving themselves that space to kind of move out of the traditional football content world. I think is just a really good example of a club deciding on a strategy, deciding to do something a little bit different, and then really seeing it through. So I think those are the three examples that come to me in terms of being able to do something, do it really well, and then set yourself apart from the competition.
Interesting, very interesting to listen about those examples with the England national team, Arsenal, and Juventus. So good to keep an eye out on those particular clubs when it comes to content. Now, our next question is one that comes up quite often, right? And I'm sure a lot of the people listening in tonight are thinking, well, how do you measure this? What are the key metrics that clubs use or should focus to measure this success on their content strategy? So I know we're not going to get into, a very detailed answer here, but if you could let us know a little bit on a high level or top level, what would be some of those metrics that clubs will focus on to measure this success?
Yeah, I think ultimately it kind of depends on what your objective ultimately is as a club. So different clubs are at different stages on this journey, and for some clubs, as we mentioned before, it's about growing that fan base, growing that audience, and therefore you might look at, just if you're operating on social media, you might look at your overall following numbers just as an indication as to whether you are successfully growing or not. And that's it's a little bit of a vanity metric, but it's also a metric that tells you that you're growing. So I wouldn't necessarily dismiss that as a way of measuring it. Equally, if you are, let's say, a little bit further down the line and actually you want to understand, you've already got a big audience, and actually the key thing is, are you able to drive revenue? Are you able to sell tickets, season tickets, memberships, whatever it may be? Then your metric may be how much of your revenue generation is coming through these channels and through these fans and so on. So that could be a success metric. Another possible metric of success is that obviously when you create content, you will be including either partner content, so content that you create with the sponsors of the club, let's say, or de facto by sharing images from games and so on, you will include images that have the front of shirt sponsor, let's say, or the sleeve sponsor, or whatever it may be, or the LED boards around the stadium. So there is a way in which you can, and there are a number of different companies that offer this as a tool, but you can start to assess the media value of the exposure that you're providing to those partners and to those sponsors. So you can start to measure that, and you can start to say, well, okay, we started at a point of content where we measured the value, the media value, the exposure value of that to be, I don't know, £2 million. And then you create more content, you focus more on being able to include those brands and those partners and so on. And then you raise it to, let's say, £6 million. That could be a metric of success for you if that's what you're trying to do, because you'll be wanting to take those types of numbers into conversations with partners or potential partners to try and build new sponsorship deals that then drive revenue for the club. So it really does depend on what your objective is as a club, but there are multiple ways in which you can actually measure that success.
Very interesting, very interesting. Right, everybody listening in tonight, be sure to stay on. We're going to have an opportunity for you guys to share your thoughts and your questions in just a moment. We do have a couple more questions to get through, but stay tuned because we will be opening the floor for your questions. The next point that I wanted to just bring forward here, Simon, is, sometimes we hear the argument that smaller or less popular clubs, if you will, compete with bigger clubs in terms of content strategy with limited budget. So how can these clubs that have less resources remain competitive and still be able to deliver that value from a content perspective despite not having perhaps the same budget as some of those bigger clubs?
Yeah, it's really difficult is the honest answer. If you're in a smaller club and you're trying to compete with a bigger club, and let's say if you're in England and you're in the Premier League and you're trying to compete with clubs like Manchester City or even Manchester United, with the volume of resource that they have and the ability that they have to create content on a regular and consistent basis, I do think that it goes back to that point around finding what is authentic about the club that you're working at, finding out what those stories are and trying to tell those stories. And when I say storytelling, it doesn't need to be, it can be a 5-minute video, it can be a carousel of images on Instagram that can tell you a story, a single image can tell you a story, or it can be a written piece. So it's again about what are the stories you want to tell. And then if your resource is limited or you have lesser resource, then adapting what you're trying to do to that resource. So let's say if you have only 2 videographers in a club, then it's going to be more difficult for you to try and create video-based content. But if you have 2 writers, then maybe you focus a little bit more on the editorial, or you use more photography. So I think it's about finding the story, adapting your resources, and then obviously there are moments where you have potential cut through if the idea is right. And the picture that you've used on this slide, Diego, is a very pertinent one, because it was I think it's the Norwich City campaign around mental health, and obviously a really simple and powerful idea that was executed really well. I don't have visibility on obviously what resource went into the or budget or so on, but Norwich are relatively speaking a smaller club than the top 6 in the English Premier League, and yet their campaign is still probably the most powerful campaign around mental health that I've seen for many years. And so it is possible to do that if your idea and your concept is really strong. And to give another example, Burnley, obviously quite relevant right now because it's been the January transfer window, but they started with that very humorous approach to announcing player signings. They take clips from movies, from TV shows and so on, and then they insert the player into it. And they've just consistently done it. And obviously other clubs have copied it since, but in my mind, that's still a Burnley idea. That's a Burnley thing, and it's identifiably them. So even though they probably have lesser resource than other clubs, they found an idea, they found an execution, they've been consistent with it, and they are able to then compete in the content space with much bigger clubs.
Yeah, no, very interesting, very interesting. Thanks for the questions. I see that we have a few coming in. Vinicius has a question, and I think a couple others. So feel free to start putting the questions. We will get to your questions in just a moment. And as we move through in the last few questions that we've planned here tonight. Now, the next point, Simon, is user-generated content. So how important is it, and in general, fan contributions for a club's content strategy involving those fans?
Yeah, I think it's increasingly, I would say it's very important. And I suppose across the football industry, increasingly important. The fan experience is something that I think clubs should be showing, engaging in. It's part of the experience of supporting a football club or being a fan of a football club, and therefore showing that experience is really important. I think there's some really good examples of it. There are many fans, for example, who take really interesting imagery from where they sit in the stadium. And in fact, when I was at Chelsea and at Brentford, we reached out to fans who did that and then included their content on our channels or collaborated with them or shared their content. And I suppose there was a dual benefit to that, which is, one, you have a fan and a different perspective and maybe a different look and feel to some of the content that you then have on a club's channels, and allows you to operate outside of your usual sort of, I guess, brand parameters. But also it's a nice way of just engaging with a fan of the club, working with a fan on something and showing that engagement, and perhaps even rewarding that that good engagement from the fan with the club and doing good stuff. Because I think any of us who are on social media can see that there is also the bad side of social media, and there is the bad comments and the bad faith actors, and there can be quite a lot of not so nice stuff. So I think it's nice to be able to engage with the fans who do the good stuff. So for me, user-generated content, fan contributions, super important. and can be a real benefit to the club. And I think the only final thing to say about that is that increasingly there are tech solutions that help with that. So there are platforms and so on that have made it easier for clubs to gather fan-generated content. I won't name any right here, just not to show any sort of favoritism or anything to any single platform, but that technology has advanced such that fans can contribute much more easily and clubs can gather that content and use it much more easily.
Very interesting for sure. Right, so the final question from my side, and then we'll open it up. I see we have some really interesting questions from the attendees tonight. Obviously, it's about driving revenue as well, right? So how can football clubs use the content they produce to potentially attract new sponsors, partners, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's partly that point that we made earlier about showing the value of the content in whichever way you want to show that, whether you want to measure it in terms of media value or you want to demonstrate the value of the content through the values of your club or the stories of your club. But I think it's also, for me, always about demonstrating that the clubs are actually the experts in their own fan bases. They are the experts in their own audiences, and therefore the content that a club can create should be the content that best reaches, best engages fans wherever they may be. So I think that from my perspective as a content person is a really fundamental part of how do you start to attract new sponsors and partners who maybe want to widen their own audiences or reach your audiences because they think there's an alignment somewhere around whether it's the club's values or what the club does on the pitch or whatever it may be. And then they want to be able to speak with a club's fan base, then the club really needs to position itself as its own expert, as the expert in that fan base and knowing them as best as possible. So I think aside from being able to deliver media value and the numbers and saying we've got huge numbers on social media, for example, it's about demonstrating that expertise and that ability to reach. If you go back to the classic marketing funnel of awareness, any brand will want awareness, consideration, conversion, and loyalty. How do you help a partner do that? Well, that's by knowing what your fan base likes and how you move them down that funnel from awareness to conversion and so on. So that's the way that I tend to see it. But equally, I'm a content person. I don't operate in the partnership sales space. So a partnerships person may have a different perspective based on the conversations that they would regularly have with other companies. So that one with a slight pinch of salt, I would say.
Excellent. Oh, really good. We have lots of takeaways after having had a few of these questions answered. So feel free to type your questions in the chat. We will be selecting as many as we can. So I know there's a few of them that have come in already. So for those that may want to add their question. In the meantime, while we see a few more questions coming in the chat, I did want to take just a couple of minutes to let you guys know about our postgraduate diploma in football, digital media, and communications that we're launching over the next few weeks. And of course, we're delighted that Simon is actually going to be the academic lead for this program. I'll just give you a little bit of an overview, and then maybe Simon can also add a few bits of information, but we won't take too long because we do want to get to your questions. It is a course that is designed for those that want to learn more on the content side, on the digital media side, on the communication side of the football industry. It has a duration of 3 months. And if you're looking to gain that hands-on experience, to grow your network, to connect with people in the audience, and advance your career, this may be a program that you want to check out and consider. Here are the modules and how they are structured. We have a module on content, which is talking on a lot about what we've discussed today in much more detail and looking at some of these topics for you to gain a full understanding on what you would need to do to perform in this type of role. And then also we have a module on communications, working with media and broadcasters, corporate communications, crisis communications, which is a question that has come up, I think, in the chat as well. So we're going to deal with that question in just a moment. And of course, a great lineup of guest speakers from across football and the industry as a whole. So this is starting out in March. If you want more information, get in touch with us. There's lots of career opportunities that you can think about pursuing and a certification of this nature can provide you an accelerated path to enhance your network, to upskill your knowledge, and to connect with people from all over the world that are, looking to gain a deeper understanding on this. So if you want to learn more, there's the information. You can scan this QR code to download the brochure. You can go to our website. Simon, I don't know if you wanted to add anything on this before we get to the questions on the chat. So anything that you wanted to say regarding this new diploma that we're launching now?
Yeah, I think the only thing to add, Diego, is that the obviously it's a huge privilege to be asked to be the academic lead on this new course. In terms of what we've tried to do with it, is we've tried to shape it based on what will provide value to people who are either already working in this space or who would like to enter into this space. And I suppose it's partly based on my own experiences, because obviously I made that move from not being in the football world into the football world and into football, digital media and communications specifically. So I've tried to make it as relevant and structured along the lines of what my experiences have been and what I think is important and what's important to know and learn and develop if you want to enhance or start a role in this area. And then we have chosen a number of speakers from across different clubs, from across different sectors of the industry, who I think will really add significant value, leaders in their fields, people who have great ideas, great thinking around this space. So yes, I would very much encourage you, if you are interested, to sign up for this course and join us as we start in March.
Right, and by the way, just one final point on this to add on what Simon was saying. When we were designing the curriculum and the program, one of the things that we said is, what would someone on your team, Simon, need in order to really gain the skills and have an understanding to hit the ground running? And of course, Simon has been involved at numerous football clubs in the content side, and in the digital side. So when we were having those discussions and when we were creating the curriculum, we wanted it to be very much a hands-on type of program where you would gain the skills and the knowledge that would allow you to actually not only have the confidence to know that you've actually prepared yourself for something that the industry needs, but also a curriculum that is very much aligned to the football industry, not so much in the traditional academic style, but more so in the industry and what is required in these types of roles. And that's what we wanted to do with this postgraduate diploma. That said, you guys have now all the information available to you. You can always check it out on our website. And if it interests you and you want to know more, let us know and we'd love to hear from you. Right, so let's get to some of the questions. And I know we had a few, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. So we'll go from the top here, from some of them that we had. So I'll start with the one from Vinicius, Simon. He says, in your opinion, how can a club increase the number of memberships or associates without depending the club performance on the pitch? Depending on the performance on the pitch.
Yeah, I suppose you have to. It's the performance on the pitch is the performance on the pitch, and obviously, fan sentiment around performances is always going to be extremely important. Football at the end of the day, for all of the work that I might do or anyone else in my field might do, I still believe that football is football, and the product, if you like to use that term, is the football on the pitch. But equally, I think that good storytelling is good storytelling, good content is good content at the same time. And so the important thing is to be consistent in what you're doing, consistent in the content that you're creating and the storytelling that you're doing, such that you have a consistency that goes across the season and goes across the postseason, the preseason, and into the next season. And that consistency and trusting what you're doing is super important, because you can't. Defeats are bad, and sometimes you might go quiet for a little bit, but you can't be quiet forever in defeat. So you have to almost at times uncouple what you're doing from what's happening on the pitch. Sometimes that's impossible, but as much as you can, do that, because you still have important stories to tell. Even in defeat, there are stories to be told and there's content to be created. And then the comeback from a defeat is always brilliant as well. So it's about finding that consistency, finding what is the right content in any sort of moment. Admittedly, if the club that you like loses 10 games in a row, I imagine their content team is having a pretty hard time, and it's difficult to do that. But if you can, as much as possible, find that consistency, find that authenticity, find those stories, then I would do that. In terms of can that help you increase the number of memberships? Well, if your objective is to increase members, then you need to find the ways in which you use the content that you're creating to market those memberships, to sell those memberships, both in terms of creating that connection, leading people down the funnel, and then finding the technical ways in which people will be able to buy memberships from you, whether that's in your own environments, in the website, on the app, whether you're able to do that through other methods. But yes, I will say again, consistency, being patient, allow results to happen, understand that football is football, and that's the bit that you can't control, but working around it as much as possible.
Oh, that's a really good point around consistency, and of course it always helps when the ball goes in, but you can't just rely on that, right? So very good question. Thank you, Vinicius. Let's go over to Reinhardt, and Reinhardt says, has Fabrizio Romano's influence on transfer news changed the way football clubs approach their announcements for players? So obviously he's a big influencer now, the biggest one, no, when it comes to transfer.
Yeah, he must be. He must be. He has. He's changed it because, and it was something that was happening anyway. Really, with social media, it's hard to keep anything secret. It's hard to keep anything hidden away. So I think what the major shift is that I would imagine that most clubs now understand that they are not going to be the ones breaking the news. Back in the day, you found out about a transfer when the player appeared on the pitch at halftime holding up the scarf. That just doesn't happen anymore because one way or another the news reaches Fabrizio Romano and he tells everyone. So you have to just live with that. And I think what that means from a content perspective is you reshape the way that you're approaching it, from trying to break the news and get the engagement based on this being a piece of news, as it were, into what people kind of know it's happening. You may not have acknowledged it as yet, but what's the right content to welcome that player into your club? And many clubs have different strategies around that. Obviously, we mentioned Burnley. I can see Burnley's being mentioned in the chat as well, but Burnley have their specific approach to it. Other clubs have different approaches. When I was at Chelsea, we during one transfer window, we went down a very sort of stylized route where we took the players into certain locations and tried to show that these, match the types of photography and the types of settings to the type of elite players that they were. So that was our thinking around that. And you'll see lots and lots of different executions on this from different clubs. So I think most clubs, as I say, they're not trying to compete with Fabrizio Romano. That's not the game. He does his thing. But they will try to create the content that best receives the player into the club that they're joining.
Great. No, really interesting. Thanks for the question, Reinhardt. So let's move over to Anisha. So Anisha talks about, let me have a look here. Yes, about Burnley's strategies where they take clips from movies and TV shows, which you talked about before, Simon. And she asks about the copyrighted content and how can this, be freely used. So how do clubs navigate the use of such content and making sure that you abide by the copyright, laws or regulations that
Yeah, I mean, I'm Anisha, thanks for the question. Should say I'm not a lawyer, so yeah, I'm a little bit nervous to answer this one, but I think basically there are laws obviously that cover copyright and IP and so on in all countries, all territories. I think there's a law and a term in the US, for example, called fair use, whereby if you take something that is copyrighted and you change it enough, or you use it in a specific way for a specific purpose, then that is okay within the law. That's my understanding of it. But I would imagine that Burnley have gone through this a few times and checked it a few times, because nothing seems to stop them doing it. So yes, I think you have to just make sure that you are on the right side of the copyright laws and the IP laws in whichever territory you're operating, and obviously globally, because all of this content will go global. And that will be part of, if I go back to the question we had right at the beginning around what's key, that will be part of your planning process. You know, if you have an idea or you have a desire to use that type of existing footage, that type of existing content to announce your signings, for example, then part of your planning process should very much be, okay, what's the IP law around this? What's the copyright law? Do we understand it? Are we able to operate within it? Because the absolute worst thing that could happen to you is that you get a copyright infringement, your content gets taken down, and somebody comes after you for doing that. So so I think that's the best way in which I can answer that without having a full legal knowledge of copyright.
Yes, no, very interesting point. So thank you for the question, Anisha. Very relevant in what you discussed there with copyright. Right, we have another question from Sophie Toth, and this actually is interesting because it's one of the modules that we have in the course, right, around crisis communication. And she asks, how much impact does a player being involved in a public scandal have on how you're planning your content at a football club? So interesting question there, no? When you have a particular scandal that you need to navigate and how you communicate that and plan in the content that you're putting out as a club.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because in football, as much as we're talking about planning content and having processes in place, there's always the unexpected that can happen, or the things that you need to react to. I mean, we already mentioned, for example, that you're not in control of what happens on the pitch in the 90 minutes. So things can happen there, and then obviously things can happen as in any walk of life with human beings, that things can happen and change, and then you have to adapt, and you have to try and be agile in terms of, okay, this has happened, and therefore maybe the content needs to be adjusted to reflect that. But as Diego says, we have a module in the course that goes deep into how do you handle crisis communications. We have a really good speaker coming in to help us with that particular module. And again, it will be about having a process in place for when something happens. What are the steps that you go through? What are the reactions that you have? What are the things that you must do to make sure that you have reacted as you should to a crisis happening? And I actually think that goes, obviously, Sophie, your questions around content, and there will be an impact on content, but I think if there is a scandal somewhere or a crisis that occurs, then that obviously goes way beyond the content, and it goes into many different areas. And we will have all seen, for example, club statements on things, institutional statements, and so on. So there's a whole discipline around that you need to dive into, and we'll explore in much more depth on the course. But yes, it's true, you need to be adaptable, you need to be agile, and just recognize that you simply cannot control everything. Things will happen.
Thank you, Sophie. Great question. We'll try to get to as many questions. We have about 10 minutes to go to keep it within an hour, that we want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I'll go to the point that Bruno says. Bruno, by the way, who looks like he's a Liverpool fan, so he's wishing you luck the rest of the season, Simon, but not against the Reds in his comment. But he has a couple of questions, and just to summarize and paraphrase, and I hope I'm being accurate here, but he asks about, what do you need as a professional, in your point of view, Simon, to work in a club in the content side and the social media side of things? What would you say are some important, I guess, skills? I think that's what Bruno is asking here in his first question.
Yeah, I mean, not to be too much of a salesman, but that's obviously what the course that we're, that we're starting in March is going to go to in quite a lot of detail. And I think there's multiple different aspects to that, working in this field. And I guess yeah, I guess going back to the point around having that ability to plan, to be able to react to things that you can't plan, having your process. I think it's always good to have lots of ideas, have content ultimately is also a very creative space, a creative industry. And so if you can ideate and you can articulate your ideas, that's a really important skill set as well. And then obviously having an understanding of as much as possible of all of the different aspects that we also touched on, for example, user-generated content and the impact that is having and why that's important, and then staying abreast of industry trends. And I know that some people have asked about AI, for example. So I think it's a bit of a mix really to be able to work in this world. It's a bit of a mix of different skills and disciplines, and it's also about experience and picking up as much experience as you possibly can. So we've tried to condense that into the course that we have, and hopefully arm you with the skills, some of those skills and some of those insights. But the most I can say for the time being is it's a huge mix of things. And actually, if I go back to when I started in this space, I started out actually as a writer. So I write content. I was an editorial person, and I've had to gain an understanding of video, of equipment, of processes, of all of this kind of thing in a short space of time. And if you'd asked me, Diego, when I was doing the SBI course in 2016, if I imagined that's where I would be, I would have had no idea. So it's a big mix.
Yes, no, it's true. And I mean, just to add to that point, what I always say, because I speak to a lot of people that are in transition or looking to upskill themselves, and my experience, having dealt with many students from across the world for many years, is that it's once you embark on that journey, once you start, when you begin untapping the potential and when you begin seeing the opportunities. Because Simon and myself and anybody here, we can have a conversation about each individual that wants to pursue a career in football or move into this space or further develop, and we can probably look at maybe 10-15% of that potential, but the other rest of that potential or opportunity comes when you actually start, and when you take that action, and when you begin and you connect with some of the classmates and you connect with the speakers, and opportunities come, and potentially an internship, and that's when the ball begins to roll. So I always say that it's a good opportunity if you're convinced that you want to take that step, whether it's with SBI or any other institute that may be out there. Taking that first step is the most important part, because that's when you're going to connect with people. That's when you're going to build relationships. That's when you're going to learn new concepts, new ideas that are going to open your mind. And that's when your brain begins to work in overdrive to try to achieve that objective. So anyway, let's try and get to a few more questions. I know we won't be able to get to all of them, but there is a question that I saw here from Daniel, which was interesting. And he says, in my career, I've always been told content is king and the money follows the eyeballs. Get the content right and the audience engagement and revenue will follow. And the question is there pressure to focus on revenue generating content, including links to club shop, etc.? Or can you keep pushing storytelling and authenticity? So I guess that balance between, providing that content that drives engagement versus, monetizing, right?
Yeah, and that I think is probably, Daniel's probably alighted upon possibly the key thing in content, in football content, is finding that balance between the storytelling and the pressure to generate revenue. The way that I see it, though, is that in a way, the two things they're not competing things, because ultimately, again, everything that we do from a content perspective is to try and drive revenue back into the football side, because it's a football club. So we want to be successful as a football club, as a football team. We want to be able to invest in whatever it may be on the football side, whether that's in acquiring new players or being able to invest in new equipment, whatever it may be, that any aspect of the club that is generating revenue, whether that's content or whether it's partnerships or ticketing or whatever it may be, that's the intention behind it. And so I think that yes, it's the key balance to be found, but equally the two things go together, because actually the revenue is going back into the football side, and the storytelling is about football and other things around the club, and therefore ideally actually the things start to become one and the same a little bit. And I think you're beginning to see that a little bit in terms of football content, particularly around partnerships, where it's improved a lot. It used to be that you would see content on football club channels that just looked like an ad from a sponsor just placed in the middle of their feed, and you'd be like, well, what's happened here? Because it doesn't look like anything else. And whereas now you're beginning to see really good executions and really interesting things being done. You know, to give you an example, I think what Google Pixel are doing with Arsenal, with Liverpool, with England, creating content that's really about the team, about the players, about the communities, and then also having initiatives around bringing more and more young female content creators into the game. These things are no longer just, you know, ads stuck on something. These are things that impact the game, the grassroots, that are helping to tell the stories of these football teams. So I'd like to think that the sweet spot is being able to combine those. But having said that, yeah, sometimes there is a pressure to link to the club shop. Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, if you are trying to drive revenue, then you will want to sell the latest home shirt, for example, and that means I don't know, for example, tagging. If you have a picture of a player on Instagram in the middle of a game, tagging the product, tagging the shirt, and a link to a place where you can buy it there. And sometimes there is that pressure, but I think increasingly it's kind of coming together, and our objective is that good storytelling, good content is good storytelling, good content, whether that's for direct just for the club, or whether it's for the club with a partner, or whether it's also got some sort of link to purchase something on it as well.
Excellent. Thank you to everybody that's participated tonight. Some really good questions. Obviously, we would have loved to get to all the questions as there were some great points to be made. But hopefully tonight you gained some insight. Obviously, learning from someone like Simon and his experience, having worked at numerous Premier League clubs and been involved in the content and communication side of things. Always great to learn from professionals that can share their insight and their experiences. So, Simon, thank you so much for taking the time to share, your points of view on the different questions that we tackled tonight. For those that may be interested, as we said, we do have our postgraduate diploma in football digital media, communications, content. This is something that we believe the market needs, and we've assembled this program specifically designed for those that may want to delve deeper in this side of the industry and upskill themselves. So if you want to learn more, there's the information that you can download. Like we said, if you scan that QR code, or if you just go to our website. And we look forward to seeing you for our next webinar. Hopefully we'll have another one of these webinars planned very soon. But in the meantime, Simon, thanks for being here tonight. Good luck tomorrow against Arsenal. We're going to be cheering for you guys. And
Thank you.
Look forward to chatting again soon.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Really, really appreciate this opportunity.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night, and see you at the next webinar. All the best, everybody. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye.